Welcome to The World Today, a program of Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's global affairs think tank. This is our first event of the fall semester. I hope everyone is safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. My name is Michael Horowitz, a Richard Perry professor and director of Perry Worldhouse. Today's guest is Dr. Paul Offit, joining us from our very own Penn Medicine. He's a researcher, a pediatrician, and a world-renowned expert in vaccines, immunology, infectious diseases, and virology. Dr. Offit is the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology, Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine, and the Director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's been a member of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization and testified before Congress on the topic of vaccine safety. He is just the person that we need to learn from about what the heck is going on with the COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Offit, thanks for joining us at Perry Worldhouse, and the floor is yours to give some introductory thoughts. What is going on with the COVID-19 vaccine?
Thank you. Typically the time it takes to make a vaccine, on average, is about 15 to 20 years. I was fortunate enough to participate with a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that developed the rotavirus vaccine, Rotatech. That took about 26 years. That's not all that far off for how long it usually takes. We had this virus, SARS-CoV-2, in hand in January. It is likely that we will have a vaccine by the first quarter of next year. That's a year and a quarter. So it's logarithmically, or at least exponentially faster than any vaccine that has ever been made. So I think people really worry about whether or not there are timelines that are being unrealistically compressed, or worse, that there are safety guidelines that are being ignored. The reason it's so fast is that basically the government has taken the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies. Normally, pharmaceutical companies go from phase 1 trials, which are usually 20 to 100 people, looking at sort of dose ranging trials, what dose is the correct dose. Then they go to phase 2 trials, which is usually a few hundred people, to make sure that the vaccine is consistently induces an immune response and that it continues to be safe. Then they go to phase 3 trials, which is usually tens of thousands of people, which are effectiveness trials, large placebo-controlled prospective trials. Half the people get the vaccine, half the people don't, and then you see whether the vaccine continues to be safe and whether it works, and then you mass produce the vaccine. But what's happened here is the government's basically said, look, we'll take the risk, because usually as you go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, it goes from like millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, the phase 3 trial for our vaccine was a $350 million trial. So the government's basically saying, we'll take the risk out of it. We'll pay for phase 3 trials. We'll pay for mass production. We'll mass produce this vaccine, even though you don't know yet whether or not it's safe and it works. So no pharmaceutical company would ever do that. And so that's why it's so much faster. In terms of worrying about whether it's too fast, because certainly a lot of the language that surrounds this is a little unnerving. You know, words or phrases like warp speed, race to make a vaccine, who are the finalists, gives you the sense that, you know, this may be unrealistically fast. As long as we do a phase 3 trial, and a 30,000 person phase 3 trial is what's being recommended by at least the NIH group. As long as you do that, and even if that trial ends a little early, as long as the reason that it ended early is because the Data Safety Monitoring Board that's overseeing that trial says that you have a clear efficacy signal, as long as that happens, then that's about what happens with any vaccine. I mean, the human papillomavirus vaccine trial was a 30,000 person trial. The conjugate pneumococcal vaccine was a 35,000 person trial. So that's the catchment. That's the safety net. As long as the phase 3 trials are done, then I think we're on the right track. But if they're curtailed unrealistically, if they're curtailed without clear evidence of safety or clear evidence of efficacy, then I think we will only further erode what is already a shaky vaccine confidence in this country. So I'm trying to be a little optimistic. I do think we can have successful vaccines, and I think we can be out by early next year. And that will be one of the 2 tools that we will use to rid ourselves of this virus, the other being hygienic measures, which we're not particularly good at, but we will need both moving forward. The vaccine is not going to be this magic thing that's going to make this all go away. We will need both hygienic measures and a vaccine if we're going to rid ourselves of this virus. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Michael, and take any questions people have.
Thanks so much. My first question actually builds on where you ended, and that the communication, this is a question about science communication as much as anything, and that if you, from an American media perspective, sometimes it seems like the spread of COVID seems inevitable, but the magic bullet of the vaccine, that is what will, that is what will save us, that we need a vaccine. That's the only way out of the pandemic. What do you think of this framing of a vaccine's place, or this vaccine's place in the overall public landscape?
Right. So I would say of the two-pronged approach to rid ourselves of this virus, between hygienic measures and the vaccine, the hygienic measures is the far more potent measure. I mean, if I wear a mask and stand 6 feet away from you, and you wear a mask and stand 6 feet away from me, you're not going to catch the virus from me, and I'm not going to catch it from you, because it's spread by small droplets. Even if I didn't wear a mask, 6 feet is really farther away than normally that small droplet would spread, because small droplets come out and then they drop down. When you wear a mask, now you're prohibiting that from spreading 6 feet. It's more like it just really spreads a few inches from your mouth. So it's a few inches and you're 6 feet away. That's pretty much 100% effective. If I wear a mask and stay 6 feet away from you, and you wear a mask and stay 6 feet away from me, we're good. If you get a vaccine, if you ask researchers and clinicians what they would love to see in a vaccine, I think they would say they would be ecstatic if the vaccine was 75% effective at protecting against moderate to severe disease, which means that 25% of people who get that vaccine aren't protected against moderate to severe disease. It also means that probably a larger percentage than the 25% are not likely to be protected against asymptomatic infection or mildly symptomatic infection, in which case you can still shed virus and be contagious. So even people who've gotten a vaccine should still wear masks. And I think it's going to be hard to convince people of that, since it's hard enough to convince them to wear masks now. But so it is a two-pronged approach. And it's not, this is, the question is, how complete is the immunity? Meaning, is it just moderate to severe disease, or is it sort of all infection like measles? And how long-lived is the immunity? And is it going to just be a year or 2 or 3, which is likely, or is it going to be more like measles vaccine, which really gives you lifelong protection? I think it's going to be more like short-lived, incomplete protection is the more likely bet with this vaccine, because that's really what happens with human coronavirus.
So how, you also touched in your opening remarks on the question of the safety of a vaccine and the, following stage 3 protocols, and that being the thing that's, most important from your perspective. Give us your sense of that. There is some controversy about the speed at which, vaccine trials are being conducted, or the use of human challenge trials. From your perspective, do you think that proper protocols are being followed, or that COVID warrants an exception to practices? Or how confident are you, basically, that the things you described in your opening remarks are happening?
I certainly think that the protocols are being followed regarding phase 3. I mean, those are trials that are supervised by the National Institutes of Health. They're being done by groups that are used to doing vaccine trials, like Pfizer, Merck, et cetera. So I don't worry about that. I think that this is not going to go through a typical licensure process. These are not going to be FDA licensed vaccines. They're going to be approved through the emergency use authorization. That's a much looser standard. And so, I mean, if you really read the FDA guidelines on what the definition of emergency use authorization is, it says may be effective. It doesn't even say is effective. But I really do think we're going to hold it to an effectiveness standard. Because if we don't, I think that would be a major mistake. So I don't really worry about that. I guess there's a pandemic going on. We have 1,000 people dying a day. I think there is a desire to get this vaccine out as reasonably fast as possible. When you do vaccine trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, each time you move to the next phase, you lessen uncertainty, but you never eliminate it. I mean, let's say you give this vaccine to 20,000 people pre-approval, that's not 20 million people. I mean, you may learn about a rare adverse event post-licensure, but you do want to make sure at least that you can eliminate uncertainty to the degree that you normally eliminate uncertainty before a vaccine rolls out.
So I want to pick up on the point you made about the measles, and that measles is, in theory, 97% effective. And if a vaccine like this is, what would be the effect if we ended up with a COVID vaccine that was, say, about 50% effective? What would be the impact, or that vaccine just wouldn't appear because that's not effective enough?
No, I think my sense from the NIH active group and from the FDA is that they would accept a vaccine that is 50% effective, remembering that the flu vaccine is about 50% effective, and that's a licensed product. There's a formula for what percentage of the population needs to be vaccinated in order to stop spread. So stop spread is defined as that the R naught, which is to say the contagiousness index, drops to less than 1. If you had a vaccine that was 75% effective, you would need to be, and that's really effective against shedding is really what you mean, or at least effective against significant shedding, enough contagious virus that would cause somebody else to be sick. If you had a vaccine that was 75% effective, you'd have to vaccinate about 2/3 of the American population to stop spread. If you had a vaccine that was 100% effective, which is true of no vaccine, you would have to vaccinate about 50% of the population. If you had a vaccine that was 50% effective, you'd have to vaccinate about 100% of the population, which you also can't do because not everybody can get a vaccine. So a 50% effective vaccine would mean that it's going to take longer, I think, to rid ourselves of this virus, even in concert with hygienic measures.
Wow, we've got 40 questions built up in the chat already, so I'm gonna turn to some of the questions. Sorry, in the Q&A, and we've got a couple different questions here that get to the questions of distribution. And what is your sense about what distribution of a COVID vaccine should look like in a country like the United States, and what it will look like? I'm sure these conversations are happening, in the expert community behind the scenes. So there's a vaccine. Like, what does that actually mean for how people get it?
Right. So there are two groups that are assigned the task of figuring out how this vaccine rolls out initially. Those groups are the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices to the CDC and the National Academy of Medicine. The sense now, the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices has already presented some of these data as to the ACIP members. The sense is that the first groups are going to be those who are at high risk of dying, like those greater than or equal to 65 years of age. Those who have certain medical conditions, like, most importantly, obesity, which actually defines, if you look at the actual definition of obesity, which is a body mass index of greater than 30, roughly 31% of the American population falls under that category. And then people with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, and others. So the high-risk groups would be among the first groups. The other groups would be essential workers. Essential workers defined as people who work in healthcare, people who work in long-term care facilities, people who work in education, people who work in mass transit, people who work in meatpacking plants, et cetera. When you add up all those people, and some of these groups obviously are overlapping, when you add up all those groups, it adds up to well over 100 million people to get a 2-dose vaccine. I mean, all these vaccines that we're initially talking about as rolling out first are all 2-dose vaccines. So if you're talking about 120, 130 million people to get a 2-dose vaccine, you're talking about 250 million doses of vaccine, which is going to be difficult to get out there. I mean, for a couple of reasons. One is your points of care obviously can't just be doctors' offices. It's going to have to be things like large chain pharmacies and maybe universities, colleges, hospitals, et cetera. And two, you have to, if you're really going to do that, give it to people who are essential workers or in high risk. How do you prove who those people are? How are they identifying themselves? Because there's a lot of people who may not fall into those categories who want to get the vaccine anyway. So I think it's going to be a little difficult. The group that's taking the lead on this out of Warp Speed, when Warp Speed is really just the manufacturing arm of this program, is the Department of Defense. They're the ones who are taking the lead on this. They presumably will work with state and local governments to figure out how best to distribute this vaccine.
So actually, I want to follow up on that. There's a question in the Q&A that asks kind of, how do you imagine it actually being rolled out to the public? And the question's from a current ER nurse that is, says there's maybe not sufficient PPE at work. How will a vaccine, how do we ensure it overcomes the barrier, those barriers to access?
By doing the best job we can. I agree. It's sort of a nightmare. I mean, we haven't even very good at distributing masks, which don't have to be maintained in the cold. I mean, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to do this. I'm sure we're going to trip and fall over ourselves a few times before we sort of get this right. And we also have to hope that the vaccine performs the same way post-approval as it does pre-approval. I mean, in the pre-approval setting, things are very well controlled as the virus is distributed by these companies to these different testing sites. They're always going to be maintained at the right temperature. And for some of these vaccines, like the messenger RNA vaccines, which are being made by Moderna and Pfizer, those need to be maintained, at least they may need to be maintained on dry ice, which is not something we're used to. And because messenger RNA is a particularly labile molecule. So again, there's going to be, I think, a real learning curve over the next couple of years on this. And remember also, you're taking this virus, this bat coronavirus, which has just made its debut in the human population. It's already done things you would have never predicted an enveloped respiratory virus that's spread by small droplets to do. One, it rages in the summer months. I mean, respiratory viruses that are enveloped, meaning that have a lipid envelope on their outside, that are spread by small droplets, they go away in the summer. I mean, even measles goes away in the summer. Flu goes away in the summer. Parainfluenza virus, respiratory syncytial virus, those are not summer disease. Yet this virus rages in Florida, Texas, hot and humid climates. Who would have predicted that? It also causes a vasculitis. I mean, it causes inflammation of blood vessels. That's why it affects virtually every organ in your body, because every organ in your body has a blood supply. It can cause strokes. It can cause heart attacks. It can cause kidney disease. It can cause liver disease. It causes long-term problems of fatigue, depression, etc. No respiratory virus does this. It disproportionately affects nursing homes. Although influenza also kills older people, fewer than 10% of the deaths from influenza are in nursing homes. With this virus is more than 40%. In some regions, it's more than 50%. And so it also causes a disease in children that I have never seen before. So-called multi-inflammatory syndrome of children, which is kind of like a combination of something called Kawasaki's disease, which is also this inflammatory syndrome, and toxic shock syndrome, which is as bad as it sounds. I mean, we have a word.
Yeah, that sounds terrible, like just in the name.
Yeah. And no virus does that. So you have this surprising virus, which has already caused these sort of surprising clinical and pathological changes that you're now going to meet with vaccine strategies like messenger RNA, replication defective simian adenovirus. That's AstraZeneca's project. The mRNA is Pfizer and Moderna. You have the replication defective human adenoviruses, which is Johnson & Johnson's product. You have so-called vectored viruses, meaning you take a virus which does replicate itself but doesn't really cause disease, and then you insert the gene in that. So these are all about strategies for which we have no commercial experience in the United States. We have never used those strategies to make vaccines before. So you have this difficult virus, this elusive, difficult to characterize virus that you're now going to meet with vaccine strategies with no history. I think we are going to learn a lot over the next 2 years. And so I think we should move forward humbly in all of this with our eyes open.
Right. I mean, I think the issues that the United States has had with testing, both in setting up testing and in supplies, consistent supplies to both administer tests and get results back quickly, I think have undermined, I think a little bit of maybe faith in the medical system from that perspective. What can we do to ensure we, once a vaccine is ready? So the two-part question here. One is, what can we do to ensure we hit the ground running, essentially, once there's a vaccine ready, and to try to avoid some of what happened with testing, especially initially. And the second is, are we likely to see one vaccine come on the market? Or you just mentioned several different options. Or are we likely to see several vaccines, all of which might be safe, but work in slightly different ways and with slightly different types of levels of effectiveness?
No, I think it'll be certainly more than one vaccine. And in terms of sort of what are we doing to make sure that things happen quickly is what we're doing, which is to mass produce the vaccine at risk, meaning mass produce the vaccine before you know whether it's safe, before you know whether it's effective, so that when you in fact get those data from a phase 3 trial, that you can roll it off the assembly line immediately. I mean, right now they're making tens of millions of doses of these vaccines without knowing whether they work or not. So I think the government actually can be applauded for that. This is a virus that's killing thousands of people a day. You just want to make sure that critical safety guidelines or critical efficacy guidelines aren't being curtailed. And so far, things look good. So we'll see. But there is an election year coming up. There are other countries like China, Russia, and the United Kingdom, which may come out with a vaccine before we do, which I think would also further put pressure on the administration. And so, this is not administration that is above perturbing science-based agencies. Take your pick: the Environmental Protection Agency with climate change, the National Weather Service with Hurricane Dorian in terms of where it struck, the Food and Drug Administration with regard to both hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma. I think are representative examples of what can happen when the administration chooses to compel various agencies to do what it wants them to do.
So I want to come back to that in a couple minutes, but first I want to turn to something that you mentioned, which is these vaccines coming out in other kinds of places. I mean, Putin says he has a vaccine. What's your assessment of the Russian vaccine and Chinese claims on vaccine development? I mean, I think we're maybe toss in the UK as well, but I'd put that's in a somewhat different category in a way, only because it seems like there's more collaboration with American actors on that. But does Putin have a vaccine?
No. So what? I mean, that was just pure political theater. I mean,
Sure.
what Russia,
I mean, I think that, but like I study international politics. I know nothing about vaccines.
Neither does Putin. What I would say is this: so the Russian vaccine is actually two vaccines in one. It's a replication defective human adenovirus type 5, which was a bad choice, and a replication defective human adenovirus type 26. The reason that the 5 was a bad choice is adenovirus type 5 is actually a fairly common adenovirus. So a lot of people already have antibodies to that particular vector, which means that they'll neutralize it before it ever has the chance to do anything good. Two, at least when Merck did a vaccine with a replication defective, a human immunodeficiency virus vaccine with replication defective human adenovirus type 5, they had a problem with actually increasing the risk of AIDS. So, but let me just explain what this means. So replication defective means the virus can't reproduce itself. Adenovirus is just a common cold virus that also causes other symptoms. By making it replication defective, it can't reproduce itself, therefore it can't cause disease. The virus is re-engineered so that it has the gene in it that codes for the coronavirus spike protein, that protein that emanates from the surface of the virus, that's responsible for attaching the virus to cells. So basically, when you're inoculated with these replication defective, genetically engineered human adenoviruses that contain the spike protein gene, you make the spike protein, your body makes the spike protein, then your body makes antibodies to that spike protein, which then presumably prevents the virus from binding to cells, or said another way, prevents the virus from infecting you. When Putin made his announcement, which was like August 22nd or so, at that point there had been a small phase 1 trial of that vaccine in 39 people, which including, according to him, also included his daughter. That's it, phase 1 trial. They hadn't even started doing a phase 3 trial yet. And then he said that we are mass producing this vaccine. We'll have millions of doses in September, and we've approved it, which tells you a lot about their approval process. I mean, they've approved something at phase 1. Good luck with that.
So what about this in some ways might be a little more of an international politics question than a vaccines question, but how concerned are you about the nationalization of vaccine development, production, distribution? Imagine a world in which there's an effective vaccine that comes out of the UK. Is there sort of significant transnational scientific collaboration that can help ensure access across borders? How worried should we be about this?
No, it's a great question. I mean, forget UK. How about if it comes out of China? Suppose China has a great vaccine that looks much better than the vaccine we're making, which they then proceed to give to their country and to their friends and allies. It becomes this sort of, national chip, international chip that they can use to further their ends. I don't know. I mean, I think that, first of all, there's tremendous international collaboration with regard to these, at least among the scientists, which is always true.
Even from because there's escalating tension in a way between the U.S. and China at a government level. You're saying there's scientific collaboration that's still going on something like, COVID and vaccines.
That's always true. I mean, the scientific community is an international community by definition. I mean, when I was working on a rotavirus vaccine, there was collaboration among all the different countries that were working on a rotavirus vaccine. That's the wonderful thing about vaccines, or science, is that it is really an international brotherhood and sisterhood. So that doesn't worry me. And frankly, let's suppose China, which is working on an inactivated viral vaccine, which they just published data on in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it looked good. I mean, let's suppose that works. We could also make an inactivated viral vaccine. I mean, there's nothing unique about the technology that's so hard. And even with the Russian vaccine, you know exactly what you're doing to make that vaccine. There's nothing proprietary. I mean, there's nothing you wouldn't know. When people talked about the Russians had spies that were trying to, that were kind of looking at what other countries are doing with vaccines. I mean, that's all generally out there. So it's not hidden.
So
I'm sorry, to answer your
if,
question, let's
yeah,
suppose we make a vaccine and we
okay,
have enough vaccine for our country. Do we have an obligation to get that vaccine into the rest of the world, into countries that are less fortunate than us economically, less fortunate than
right.
us technologically? Of course we do. I mean, how much more information do we need that what happens in other countries affects us?
Yeah, seems like it. So, all right. So suppose there are these vaccine options, and suppose three of these. Suppose there's a Chinese vaccine there, and two of the American ones pan out. How, I can't even imagine. I mean, we're now like several steps down the chain, but how would you decide which vaccine to get?
I think it hopefully, as we generate more and more data, you may find that there are vaccines that work well in one population and not another. I mean, for example, the influenza vaccine is not a particularly effective vaccine for the greater than 65-year-old. But yet it's recommended for the greater than 65-year-old. The shingles vaccine is great. I mean, it's excellent in this greater than 65 years old. So there are sort of horses for courses, as we say at the track. I mean, you may find that there are subsets that work well in one population, but not as well in another. But that, again, you're just going to learn over time. And most of these trials that are being done are not being done in people less than 18 years of age. So we really aren't going to learn anything about the pediatric population until I think after these vaccines are already out there.
And there have been some reports that some of these vaccines might be less effective at protecting the elderly as well. I mean, is that also your sense, or is that hype?
Right. Well, I'm a member of the elderly, actually, as defined as greater than 65. Just let us go. Let us go. We've had our chances. No, just kidding.
The baby boomers have done enough.
I mean, if you look, for example, at the shingles vaccine, I mean, that's a purified protein adjuvanted vaccine that works extremely well. There are purified protein adjuvanted COVID-19 vaccines too, so you wonder whether or not that may be the vaccine that works better in an elderly population than would these other vaccines. But again, there's no experience with mRNA vaccines. There's no experience with replication defective simian adenovirus vaccines or human adenovirus vaccines. We just don't have any experience with that. So I'm open-minded to see what we can find.
So turning back in some ways to the United States, there were several questions in the chat about two topics that I now want to get to. One is about the politics of this, and the second is about herd immunity. Let's do herd immunity first, because I want to get your sort of scientific perspective, on that. The president has a new pandemic advisor who there were some media reports suggested, advocated herd immunity as a strategy. Is herd immunity a reasonable way to think about what, an American response to COVID over the next several months? What are the costs and benefits of that? And, you're the expert.
Right. So the term herd immunity simply means that you've vaccinated or that a large enough percentage of the population is immune to a pathogen that the virus or bacteria can no longer spread. That's what it is. So you can induce herd immunity either by natural infection or by immunization. I would ask Dr. Atlas to name one instance in the history of this world where natural immunity has extinguished a virus, because there is none. I mean, here's a virus, SARS-CoV-2, which I think in the best case scenario will induce short-lived incomplete immunity, meaning short-lived meaning years, not decades, incomplete meaning protection against moderate to severe disease, but not mild or asymptomatic disease, both of which can be associated with shedding and contagiousness. If you look at vaccine, if you look at a virus like measles induces lifelong immunity that's complete, meaning you're protected against all forms of the infection. You're not even going to be reinfected, much less symptomatically reinfected. And it's lifelong. I mean, I am a child of the 50s. I had measles. I'm protected against measles for the rest of my life. Nonetheless, every year there would be 1 to 2 million cases of measles. There would be about 50,000 hospitalizations and 500 deaths. This virus, it doesn't have those characteristics. Same thing with smallpox, by the way. Smallpox, very contagious virus, lifelong immunity. But again, the only thing that eliminated measles and the only thing that eliminated smallpox was a vaccine. And that's going to be true here too. I mean, Sweden is the best example. Sweden, although Sweden was doing a number of protective things that don't get as much play as it should, but so they were a little more free about letting the virus run wild. They certainly did worse than surrounding countries like Denmark and Finland in terms of hospitalizations and deaths. But I think they're a cautionary tale for why it is that would never work. Apparently, Dr. Atlas retracted that. He said that he actually never said that to the Washington Post. But it's a fanciful idea. As Dr. Fauci said, it would never work.
So there's some questions that have come through in the Q&A asking about vaccine side effects and how we, I think there are probably, two parts to this. The science part to it might be, or the vaccine education part. How do we think about, a vaccine could be relatively safe but generate side effects in some populations. How do we think about that in thinking about the costs and benefits of a vaccine? And then I want to turn to the question of how you actually get people to take a vaccine.
Well, I think you're not going to get people to take a vaccine until you know what its characteristics are. So I think that if we can go to the population and say, look, here's a vaccine that's been tested it's been given to 20,000 people. In that 20,000 people, you're represented. There's an adequate representation of the elderly, adequate representation of minority populations, African-American, Latinx populations, adequate representation of younger people, 75% effective. You have a 3 out of 4 chance of not having moderate to severe disease, a 3 out of 4 chance of not being admitted to the hospital or not dying. And it's been tested in tens of thousands of people. And the virus is killing 1,000 people a day. Do you want to get that vaccine? I think most people would get that vaccine. But again, you want to make sure you have the data. But you also have to make sure that you let people know what you don't know. You don't know how long effectiveness is going to last because you haven't tested it for that long. You don't know whether or not it causes a rare serious adverse event. You're only going to know that post-licensure, but there are things, or post-approval, but there are things in place like the Vaccine Safety Data Link, the PRISM system, et cetera, that's run by the FDA that can look at millions of people, tens of millions of people once vaccines are released to see whether there is a problem. So you have to be honest with people about what you know and what you don't know.
So it seems like a key part of your answer to the last question is the notion that that phase 3 testing accurately represents the population, meaning that in varieties of different sort of categories and in subcategories, that you have sufficient numbers of people tested to sort of ensure to be able to generalize on average to the population as a whole. How confident are you that that's what's actually happening in these trials, or is that part of the protocol that you sort of outlined at the outset?
That's part of the protocol. I mean, you want to make sure you adequately represent, the elderly, people who are minority populations. That's when the NIH Active Group, which was put together by Francis Collins, basically came up with what they thought how these studies should be done. That was a big part of how these studies should have been done. So I think that's, we're learning about what percentage, for example, in Pfizer's vaccine or Moderna's vaccine, percentage of the minority, it's about 13% or so. They're hoping for a greater percentage so they can be more accurately reflect the American public. Typically, the FDA, when they license a vaccine, and this is obviously not a typical situation, will only license a vaccine that's tested in the United States because they want to make sure that it adequately represents the United States. The question will happen, what happens if, say, AstraZeneca gets approval for use of the vaccine in the United Kingdom and it starts to move out there? Would the FDA be willing to look at United Kingdom data and say, close enough, we're in the midst of a pandemic, let's use this vaccine? I don't know.
Okay. That's fair. I mean, let me ask a related, or I guess related in my mind, sort of question, which is about the sort of anti-vaccine movement in the U.S. As someone that, you've worked on vaccine education, efforts for, throughout your career, one imagines that as a vaccine debuts in the United States, there'll be all sorts of it will just be wild and looking at Facebook groups and, discussions of all sorts of, varieties of conspiracies. So, there are a large number of people that, according to poll data, say that they wouldn't be vaccinated against COVID, even if a vaccine was available. Now, how do we combat that? From a public relations perspective, when there's a vaccine, or if hopefully when there's a vaccine that, that's safe.
So again, I think I'm not sure what these polls mean now. I mean, the CNN and Boston Globe polls ask, would you get a theoretical COVID-19 vaccine? I mean, there is no vaccine. So you're asking, would you get a theoretical vaccine? If you asked me that question, I would say not till I see the data. So I guess I would have been in the no category on that question. And I have a good attitude about vaccines. So
one would imagine, yeah.
I think that we need to sort of see what the vaccine looks like first before we make too much of that. I mean, I sort of divide the sort of the anti-vaccine sentiment in this country into two categories. One is the reasonable category. I think the skeptic, the people who just want to make sure that there's good evidence that this vaccine works and is safe. That's fair. I mean, I think you should be skeptical of anything you put in your body. That's fine. And I find when the people who are skeptical about vaccines call me, I think that, I can generally find out what worries them about a vaccine, and at least try and explain what data we have to refute that ill-founded fear. And then there's the vaccine cynic. I mean, this is the anti-vaccine conspiracy theorist activist. I mean, the Bobby Kennedy Juniors of this world. You're never going to convince them. I mean, you could have a perfect vaccine and they're still going to find fault with it. They think vaccines cause things that vaccines don't do. They think vaccines cause autism and diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and that's just not true. So, and they still believe that, even though there's abundant evidence showing that they're wrong. And people still believe vaccines cause autism. I mean, there's like about 24 studies showing that it's not true. I'm not sure what it's going to take to convince them of that, and nothing will convince them of that. Unfortunately, they're a very small group. I think they're true anti-vaccine activists, the conspiracy theorists, the person who thinks that the influenza vaccine causes COVID-19. Them you're never going to convince, so don't try.
All right, let me take a side detour for a second into influenza, because there are actually several questions in the Q&A from people saying like, hey, when should I get my flu shot this year? And and actually somebody it made me happy because it was a good news question. Somebody asking, do we have the potential for a lighter flu season? Because so many more people are wearing masks than normally do.
I think that's likely to happen. I think there's already some evidence of that in other countries that
silver lining.
Say it again.
Silver lining.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it's and also maybe true for whooping cough, that if you wear a mask and social distance, I mean, these are spread by these viruses and bacteria are spread by the respiratory. I'm sure we're going to have a lesser, or I'm not going to say anything because I've been so wrong about this virus, but I think it would not at all be surprising to see a lesser incidence of flu this year. True. And when should you get the flu shot? You should get it now. I mean, it's available now.
So here's a question that's come up several times. We've done, both in the spring and summer, and now we've done a series of events on COVID for COVID and public health sorts of issues for our audience. Where do you get your information about COVID? About what's going on? Where should, if you want to avoid those, I mean, obviously, like, it's a caricature to talk about like people getting their information from Facebook groups, but where is it that you get your information, and where would you recommend people go if you want a reality-based assessment of what's going on with COVID and how to be thinking about the progress that these vaccine trials are having?
Well, where I get my information is from the medical literature. There's actually this guy at Cornell who sort of summarizes all the key papers that have come out in the previous week, because there's like, honestly, thousands of papers that are put out there in the medical literature a day about COVID-19. So it's just an avalanche of information. I mean, he's really good about summarizing all that. So he's been great for me in terms of getting information. I read the medical literature generally. I mean, so, when the paper comes out about China's, inactivated vaccine, I have that paper and I get
sure.
I think for people who don't want to read that, what I would say, because most people actually, frankly, just don't have the expertise necessary to read, sort of virology, immunology, epidemiology-based papers, which is fine. I think, so you want summaries of that, that are written roughly at newspaper level, roughly 8th grade level, so you can understand that. And I think there are a lot of good places out there. I think the CDC, I think, the generally hospital and university-based websites that have information about COVID-19 are very helpful. I think, less helpful are chat rooms and places where you're just getting somebody's opinion. I mean, you'd like to have sort of science-based opinions.
Speaking of things popping up in the news, there were reports, I think yesterday, of people being reinfected by COVID. Do you think I'm sure you've read some medical literature on this. What's your sense of how big a deal is that? Is that, is that fake news, or is that, I please tell me it is, or is that something we need to be really worrying about? And then how, because presumably that then has an impact on things like vaccine effectiveness.
When you make a vaccine, the most important question you can have answered is, does natural infection protect against disease associated with reinfection? Because if that's true, then you just try and find out what part of the immune system is associated with that protection and then mimic it in your vaccine. I mean, we were making a rotavirus vaccine. You know, there was a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine that babies who got a rotavirus infection in the first year of life, when they then were subsequently reinfected, were much less likely to get moderate to severe disease. That's what you want. You want to be able to make a vaccine that keeps you out of the hospital and keeps you out of the morgue. It doesn't have to necessarily protect you against reinfection. And so a lot of those early reports that came out on reinfection, the person initially had sort of moderate disease or severe disease on the first infection, and then on the reinfection was either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. That's fine. That's fine. What you don't want is moderately sick, gets better, and then moderately sick again. Now that's going to happen too, because even natural infections are going to be 100% protected for this kind of virus. So I don't think there's anything in the literature that's come out about that I find particularly worrisome. In fact, it's largely hopeful, because most of those stories were reinfection, but not nearly as severely ill, which is what you want.
So I want to back up a little bit, and that's, to return to something that you mentioned before, and talking about debates about vaccines in the context of other issues with government agencies, in the United States. And, science research and science itself has become increasingly politicized in recent years. And, whereas in the research that we do to have breakthroughs in these areas often relies on funding from government entities. Where do you see the intersection of science and politics, in your work and that of your colleagues?
I think what we're seeing right now is really unprecedented. I mean, we have a pandemic that is killing us, that has caused us to stay in our house, that has just driven the economy, down as far as it can go. I mean, it was like 10% unemployment. I mean, 28 million people unemployed. Everybody talks about how the stock market's going up, and that's good. It's nothing to do with the economy. I mean, it's just there's nowhere else for money to go. It's just we couldn't be worse off. And so what do you need now? What you need is hard work and hard thinking from the federal government. Instead, you get Steve Atlas. I mean, instead you sideline people like Francis Collins or Tony Fauci. You have, what do you need? You need to control this disease and prevent it. We have the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as it turns out. That's just what we need. You should be hearing from people like Ann Schuchat and Nancy Messonnier at the CDC every day. Every day they should be on a podium telling you what the federal government is asking you to do in terms of testing, in terms of contact tracing, in terms of quarantining, in terms of wearing masks, social distancing. How can we get back to school in a way that at least mitigates risk? I mean, you're not going to eliminate the risk in school, but at least mitigates the risk. I mean, how do we do all that so we can start to get back to work in the safest way possible? And we don't have any of that. I mean, it is hard to watch how, for example, suddenly you're hearing a story for a couple of days about how, like, extracts of oleander flowers, could be it, because, the guy who makes, bedroom accessories has that idea. I mean, it reaches a level of parity. There's an enormous amount of technological expertise in this country that is being sidelined by this administration at a level that has never been sidelined before. And it's hard to watch. And I, as much as I blame our president for that, I also blame everyone who enables him to do that.
And then in that vein, what's to stop President Trump from, say, pulling a Putin and announcing a vaccine, just before the November election?
Well, in theory, the commissioner of the FDA. I mean, he can't. Okay. He has to get EUA emergency use authorization approval from the FDA. He can't do that himself. Now, you could argue he could go to Stephen Hahn and say, "Look, I want FDA approval for that," and Stephen Hahn says no. And he says, "All right, you're fired. I'm going to hire somebody who'll say
sure.
Yeah." That does seem to be the trend. But again, if that happens, if something like that happens, and you have a lot of the sort of academics who are involved in this standing up in the media saying, I wouldn't get this vaccine. I don't think it's been adequate. I think that it may defeat its purpose of sort of having the big October surprise.
Interesting. So you think that the knowledge in the academic community, in the science community about vaccine development means that essentially, like, word will get out pretty quick. I
think so, yeah. Yes. Well, first of all, remember, if Stephen Hahn meant what he said he is going to present these data to the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. I'm on that committee. I mean, it's an open meeting. It's open to the public. It's because it's a federal vaccine it's federal advisory committee, just like the advisory committee for immunization practice meetings are open to the public. So I think that's great that we all get to see the data. We all get to make decisions about how robust we think the data are.
So what are things that you think we could do to try I mean, and in some ways, I realize what I'm about to ask you is like a little bit of an impossible question, but in a world where you have many people not following standard public health practices, sort of like wearing masks that public health officials are recommending, and you have a president that, is often skeptical of some of those things, what are ways to, essentially to increase public confidence, or are we just kind of stuck, given the sort of remarks that the president makes?
I think when you looked at that rally in New Hampshire, Trump's rally in New Hampshire, and the guy gets up to the microphone and says, look, New Hampshire law, we're asking you to wear masks, and people boo. They boo. I mean, do they think the germ theory is just a theory? Do they think that viruses can't be contagious? I mean, it's a level of willful ignorance that is supported by by our president that is hard to watch. I mean, his attitude about this has largely been to deny it and spin it instead of doing all the hard work that other countries have done to try and get it under control. And he could be so much better at just setting an example here. I mean, just to make sure that we're masked. We're not helpless here. It's not, first of all, vaccines aren't going to be the wonder medicine we think they are. I mean, they'll definitely be an important component here, but wear a mask and do the best you can at social distance. I mean, it's not that hard. It's so simple to do and so effective. Robert Redfield said this, head of the CDC. He said, just if we all wore masks, we would do much better at getting control of this virus. We can't do it. You look at that bikers convention in South Dakota. It's like, it's my freedom, it's my liberty. I'm sorry, it's not your freedom to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection any more than it's your freedom to run a stop sign. It's just hard to watch this. I mean, maybe it's not Trump's fault. Maybe he's just appealing to something that is uniquely American, this kind of cowboyism. That
so like we're going to do whatever we want. Yeah.
And the hell with society.
So speaking of the head of the CDC, they changed their guidelines about recommending testing asymptomatic individuals, which led to a firestorm of media commentary with the former directors of NIH and USAID publishing an op-ed that now it's time to ignore the CDC. And then Dr. Fauci was on I think the Sunday morning talk shows this weekend saying, or I think it might have been a media appearance yesterday saying, actually, like, this isn't that big a deal, like, it's fine. What is that controversy and how big a deal is it?
Well, the original recommendation was that if you come in contact with someone who is known to be infected with this virus, that you would be tested. I mean, that was the original, because that's what contact tracing is.
Right.
Then there was a statement made that we didn't need to do that. We didn't need to test asymptomatic people. And then there was that was walked back. So that looked political. I mean, it looked like it fed into this notion that we're doing too much testing, and that the reason that we have a problem in this country is because we're doing too much testing. Although the facts are that we have roughly 4% of the world population and about 25% of the deaths. That's not too much testing.
It's a rough look.
Yeah. So it looked bad. I mean, I think we're getting to the point where, because these great people at the CDC or NIH are being sidelined, and the FDA now is coming under suspicion. That's bad. When you don't trust the FDA, that is bad for the American public. Not just for vaccines, but for drugs also. You have to trust them because they've been enormously trustworthy. I mean, if you look at the history of Michael Harris is an historian, and he says it best, the history of drug regulation is built on tombstones.
That is a great and depressing statement. Here, a very quick question for you that came up in the chat. People wanted to know, what's the name of that person from Cornell that's summarizing the data on COVID, and can they get access too?
Honestly, his name is John Moore.
John Moore?
M-O-O-R-E.
All right. So what do you think we should do about in the Q&A, there have been a bunch of other questions. There have been more questions kind of coming in, actually, even, since we, circling back to something we talked about before, looking at, asking about therapeutics. Actually, we didn't talk about that. Sorry, I was thinking about something else I was going to ask you next. where are we with therapeutics? Do you think that that is, in the two big things that you mentioned at the outset about how to deal with the virus, you mentioned mask wearing in a vaccine, but you do have companies working on varieties of therapeutics to mitigate the consequences. Why wouldn't it be a big three essentially? And, where do you think we are in progress?
Well, I mean, is because I think you're supposed to say this at every Penn sponsored event. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as Ben Franklin said. And I think, that's true here too. Remdesivir is an antiviral drug that probably decrease the incidence or the length of infection by about 4 days. Dexamethasone is also of value for the hospitalized and severely affected patient, but none of these therapeutic interventions. I mean, I think monoclonal antibodies, a convalescent plasma doesn't work, frankly, if given, at least when it's been given, which is after symptoms already started. I mean, do I think convalescent plasma would be of value during the incubation period of this infection, which is to say from when you're first exposed to when you develop symptoms? Yes, I think it probably would be of value, as it has been for other infections. But so I think monoclonal antibodies, these sort of long-lived monoclonal antibodies, would be of value if given during the incubation period of the infection, or even just preventively, because now they can last 4 to 6 months for, let's say, for older people who don't respond very well to the vaccine. But for the most part, I think the money here is in prevention, whether it's by hygienic measures or by vaccines. I think that's our best way to deal with this. Usually, once it's already happened, antivirals and drugs are much less impactful.
So, turning back to the globe and thinking about the global spread of COVID and global distribution of a vaccine. What's your, put on your forecasting hat here, what's your diagnosis for how long until travel and trade are reopened? How long before you and I are getting on an airplane to go to an academic conference again?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that question as long as you don't hold me to my answer. Well, I don't know, but I mean, if you ask me, when do I think?
You know more than I do, though.
The question is not when we eliminate this disease. We're not going to eliminate it in the immediate future. The question is when we get comfortable enough that the level of infection and that the level of hospitalization and that the level of death is something we can live with. I mean, we do that with influenza every year. I mean, influenza last year caused 50 million cases, 780,000 hospitalizations, and 60,000 deaths. Yet we walked around and went everywhere and didn't wear masks, and we accepted that. This is a new virus, which is why I think we accept it less, because we just don't know about it. But if we were,
we haven't internalized the notion of some persistent risk.
Yeah, and people will say typical flu, the usual flu. I mean, flu kills you.
Right.
We've sort of accepted that at some level. So I think at some level, the question really is, when do we accept that here? When are we willing to get on a plane knowing that we could get this infection? It's possible, but that that only 5 people are dying a day, 10 people are dying a day. And so we feel that the odds are better in our favor. We're willing to take that risk because we take risks every time we walk outside. So I'm going to guess that I think that we will feel much more comfortable 2 years from now.
Because listen, I will say, some of that's generally sort of has very much been, on the side of those that think American global leadership is a force for good in the world. It's super embarrassing that the rest of the world is like, we don't want you here right now. And, so when borders open, I think is both an important public health question. It's a question that gets to when the U.S. in some ways, when the rest of the world sees the U.S. as competent again, from a public health perspective. And, if you, and so I've got time for just a couple more questions before we wrap up, but, in looking at, sort of, are there any vaccine candidates we haven't talked about yet? So not necessarily vaccine candidates in the US, but we talked about the UK a little bit, talked about Russia, we talked about China. If you were going to sort of ask me again, as a non-medical specialist off the top of my head, what are countries that, you'd think about for this? Like those would be countries, you would imagine. But what about Israel or Singapore? Are there other countries that aren't in the public discussion essentially that, and great, by the way, I see you had a really nice looking cat in the background wandering around.
It's a Boston Terrier, but yeah.
Oh, Boston Terrier. All right, there you go. Well, great. I like dogs better than cats anyway. Cats are the worst. But are there other countries working on vaccines that we should be paying attention to that are maybe flying under the radar from a public perspective?
Well, let's see, we're doing, at least in the US, we're doing all these sort of genetic vaccines, messenger RNA, DNA, replication defective simian or human adenovirus. I mean, that's sort of what we're at. I think China is doing inactivated vaccine and also live attenuated viral vaccine. Those are two strategies we're not currently pursuing here, both of which could be excellent, both of which may be better, and both of which have, you have enormous commercial experience because we make other vaccines using both of those strategies. So those may emerge. I mean, it would be interesting to see if that is what happens. So I think China would be the other country I would look at. They did have a little bit of a head start here. So we'll see.
And then the last question, we've gotten several questions about this, about medical tourism, asking about both the potential for Americans to go abroad and get a vaccine if it's developed elsewhere but not available in the US, and the potential for others to try to come to the US if there's a vaccine in the US that maybe isn't being widely distributed, outside these borders. Do you, to what extent is that a thing that just inevitably happens in the world of vaccines, or something that would be relatively rare? And are there risks there of that actually generating COVID spread?
Well, I mean, it certainly happens. I mean, when the meningococcal serogroup B vaccine was licensed, say in Canada before it was licensed here, there were parents who drove their children up to Canada to get that vaccine in advance of it coming here before it was licensed here. I don't think there's any risk in terms of it would be a less safe or less effective vaccine. That doesn't worry me. In terms of traveling and increasing your risk of being exposed to the virus, you're probably worse off being in this country.
So I want to close with a question on public health officials and the warnings we've had about a pandemic for years. And this actually comes from a Penn student in the Q&A, and that once a COVID-19 vaccine is developed, what other structural changes are necessary to public health systems to prepare for the next pandemic? Particularly if what if the next virus, for example, there isn't an Operation Warp Speed that can rapidly develop a vaccine.
Well, actually, after the fear of the H5N1 pandemic, the influenza bird flu pandemic, we did put things in place to sort of mass produce vaccine, to have sort of testing, to have sort of warning systems. And that was somewhat taken apart actually by the current administration, which didn't help. But you can assume there'll be another pandemic. I mean, there's been 3 just in the last, 20 years or so with, SARS-1, then MERS, now this virus. And then there's always the occasional flu pandemic about 3 times a century. So, there'll be a pandemic. I'd like to think that we have learned a lot from this and we'll be much better prepared next time to act quickly and not just try and figure out a way to spin it. Instead, we actually just try and deal with it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Offit. I hope everyone, we've had over 400 people participating in the event today. We had about 100 questions in the Q&A, and I hope everyone will join me in thanking Dr. Offit for educating us about the race for a COVID-19 vaccine. And I hope everyone will join us for our next edition of The World Today, which will be Tuesday, September 8th at a special time at 9:30 a.m. It'll be in partnership with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We'll be bringing together Penn's Dr. Zeke Emanuel and Dr. Lothar Wheeler of the Robert Koch Institute, Germany's National Public Health Institute, for a virtual conversation with myself and Karen Donfried, who is the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So thank you, Dr. Offit. I've learned a lot. This has been incredible. We really appreciate it. And we hope everybody, especially you, stays safe during these crazy times.
All right, thank you. Take care.